Okay, hello guys, today is the 24th of February 2023, so it's 1 year since the war in Ukraine has started, and I thought I'd really kind of make a video about like an update about what's going on. I'm gonna reference some of my videos that I have made before on this subject, because like I said, this is more of a my YouTube channel is more of a diary rather than a professional channel where people post like every day and make professional videos. But overall, we're gonna lately there's been like very little big moves. There's almost no big moves since I last made a video about Ukraine on the fronts. So this Russians have killed like 40,000 soldiers, kind of trying to capture a little bit of territory just down here in the east, like Avdiivka. Something came up on Vuhledar, so these areas, but they slowly kind of pushing through, but they've lost about like 40,000 people to move by about 3-4 kilometers. So obviously, compared to the start of what happened at the start of the war, it's laughable. You know, they can as well pick up and leave. But we're gonna look at what was happening in Ukraine over this year, and like where things, how things are moving slow. So why I started with my channel opened up. It's so yeah, just to kind of point out, I do have this is an initiative United 24 by Ukrainian president, so they have quite a few things if people want to support Ukrainian army and other projects. But what we're gonna look at is kind of the histories, Ukraine one. Yeah. So this is the video I have made about, yeah, so this is when the Ukrainian war just started, so this is where I'm starting from kind of. And when I was making this video, I have this thing here, let's just open it up. Right, it starts with this, and this essentially there's a conversation I had just before the start of the war with someone, where they've sent me and says Putin has declared that Donetsk and Lugansk is now part of Russia, and I think and my reply was look, the war is gonna start by the summer, so in the summer there will definitely gonna be war. There's gonna be 2 main strikes from Crimea and Luhansk and Donetsk towards each other, and then trying to send the troops, Marines kind of thing, somewhere to capture Mariupol. Right, but the Marines have never landed. Their ships got pushed away from Ukrainian seaside, but obviously, and then so this is going to be the kind of big strikes, and then there will be a few strikes from on the borders of Russia and Belarus into Ukraine. So if we're gonna look at the map of the time, so we're gonna go to the map, let's see. Right, so if we try to see updates, nope, that's not the one. Okay. Okay, but if we look at the map of the past, and let's just see if we can use some other map which has got dates on there. But that's where we had seen at the time. It's like that. Okay, temporary allow everything. sorry, it's just being slow. But at the time the strikes were like from Crimea, from Donetsk, Lugansk, obviously in these directions. So this part of Ukraine is still captured, obviously because the Russians haven't invaded. But we also see strikes that are happening towards Kiev, Sumska Oblast, Kharkiv. So these are the strikes which are like not as powerful as these two, but still powerful enough that the Ukrainian army had to defend from. Something I also said at the time was like, look, they're gonna continue doing missile strikes from different directions, and they continue doing this, and which is like do strikes from different directions and onto different, especially civilian targets, and this is done to keep Ukrainian air defenses in bit more under pressure and having to be more spread out, right? Because that would allow their planes to at least try and do something at the front. It's like they've lost quite a few airplanes, they've lost quite a few. Oh, I've lost that thing. The Russian. I lost the article where they were showing the Russian losses, so we're gonna have to look that up. So, right, but as we can see, what was happening back then and was like they essentially kind of followed the same scenario that I described in my text to my friend, but obviously those were the most obvious scenarios which were discussed by some people. Some people kind of would say, oh, they might do this, they might do that, and now we see that the West, like what I said, that the West was losing. Unfortunately, the West is still losing. Like, it's showing that it's very, very slow in its actions. Like, it takes a very long time to decide anything. And Ukraine would have pushed the Russians back, whichever happens, because as we can see on this map, like, all these pushbacks have happened while the Russians were actually attacking, while the Ukraine was receiving almost no aid from the West, so almost no weapons, right? And yet all those pushbacks happened here. Like, okay, there was the last big offensive here and near Kherson, but those did happen with Western weaponry, but with some Western weaponry involved. Not in the east, not near Kharkiv. These ones was all Ukrainian weapons, and near Kherson they did use Western weapons to kind of hold the Russians under control, but in the end the Russians just ran away in the end, just dropped everything. And the Western weapons were not as influential to kind of move the battle, it's just literally because Russians ran away. But they were very influential in destroying the Russian supply lines. And something I said at the start of the war in the first video I made about this conflict, I said, look, the faster the West starts to help Ukraine, the less damage there's going to be, not just to Ukraine, but to Russian people as well. So Russians have lost, let's look it up. Look. In Ukraine. Right, Ukraine-Russian war, 300,000 casualties a year. So there's Ukrainians and Russians. Yeah, total wounded. Right. So there's different ones, but yeah, we see generally 140 something thousand troops already dead. And we still hear people like talking that, look, you know, the Russia's gonna win. Like, you know, guys, the Russia couldn't win, you know, while they were attacking with their professional units, with the best tanks, with the best airplanes, you know, with their storage, ammunition storage completely full. And what we're hearing now is that actually Russians are starting to Russian, Ukrainian army. So Russian army losses over 100,000 people. Like, this is how many people they've lost in Afghanistan in 15 years. This is how many people they've lost in Ukraine in just 1 year, right? Sorry. So we see that, like, this is not something like minor. And again, something, as I said, was happening is that a lot of that is an internal Russian affair. Like, they are fighting to keep the power, to keep people kind of telling, there's like a phrase which they had going around Russia: if not Putin, then who? Right, and essentially they keep on trying to keep that momentum going. They're trying to keep people wanting to believe that without the particular people in power, the Russia is going to be attacked by Americans, and they essentially, all of their propaganda channels says that, yeah, the America is attacking us. You also hear the sell-off channels in the West, mostly on YouTube, really, kind of. I think there's a couple of big TV channels which will do the same, which repeat that apparently America has attacked Russia in Ukraine. It's like NATO has invaded Russia by never being in Ukraine. That's somehow, it's like turned into the part where it's like the West doesn't know what to do. It's like but this is kind of the news that comes around. So over the year, like, we see the Russians have lost it. They've lost, killed 146,000, wounded 440,000. I'm not sure. They've started attacking with over 150,000 soldiers on a few directions. Has probably been a bit more, because that was only 150,000 of the Russian army, but there was also other units. We see that private military companies, like, taking part by bringing by essentially hiring prisoners out of prisons and saying, look, if you fight for so long, we have this order from the president and you're going to be set free. They've been mobilizing people as well, 200 to 300 people, and they still continue mobilizing people. But the problem the Russians are having now, which is something I've pointed out, and again, not just kind of information I get from people talking about stuff, listening to different people talk about the situation in Russia or situation in Ukraine, saying that, look, the Russian military did not have the means for delivering those people, or didn't have enough of them trained. And that was exactly that. It's like, essentially, there was one Russian commentator which said like that, and he said it before the Russian invasion into Ukraine. He was saying that if Russia invades Ukraine properly, it's like a drunken soldier picks up a grenade and goes up with that grenade against a couple of Tiger tanks. That was the kind of his comparison, that of Russian military capability versus the West. But Ukrainians at the moment, Ukrainians are slowly pushing Russians back and keeping them in place, essentially destroying Russian troops. So at the moment, the target of Ukrainian troops is like, look, if they're attacking you, hold them off, kill as many as you can, and if you have to, move back at the right time to the right position. It has been like, it's the way it started from the very start, that the Russians went in and essentially they lost lots of fighting capability by being too far in, by extending the supply lines. And what we see is that in Ukraine, obviously, the Russians have only a very limited amount of supply lines they can use, because they can't use airlifting very much. They don't have that capability. And as soon as they get away far from like any railways or something like this, they don't have the capability, because they don't have the trucks, they don't have the ability to the petrol to deliver there, and like essentially they were losing this war on that front. And they have higher air power, and we're gonna talk about this because what we see now, this obviously what we're gonna talk about is obviously, yes, there was Western help, and just recently, Ukraine war, West supplies tanks. No. West supplies tanks to Ukraine. Yeah. So there were people already talking that the West will supply tanks, finally will supply tanks to Ukraine. It's still not, they're still not really there. Obviously the Western help was amping up, so it was like growing and growing. And again, there's many pro-Russian channels saying, why are we giving weapons to Ukraine? And like, you know, let just Russians take this. And I was always saying, look guys, if you want everybody to suck Putin's dick, lead by example. Get on a fucking plane, get on the train, get on the bus, go to Russia, like, you know, suck Putin's dick. If you're not doing this, if you're sitting in a comfy studio and talking shit because Russians have paid you, go fuck yourselves, okay? You're a bunch of fucking cunts. YouTube not gonna like that, but it's good that not many people gonna watch this video anyway. Right, but what am I talking about here is like, we see that West is very slow in supporting Ukraine, and what is the problem in that for the West? Why is it like everybody goes like, look, you know, we're getting Russia, is like, and yet the West is continuing to lose, right? The slow motion of the West is losing them a simple battle of, like, how do you put it, like, battle of faith, really, like, because the modern world is built on the fact that, hey, you know, we are not arming ourselves, we're not all arming ourselves to the teeth, but what we're doing is that we're like working together with some countries that will, then if shit goes sideways, like, we're essentially entrusting our security to a number of countries which are like the guarantors. Actually, one of the guarantors was Russia, but for that we produce for them, like, we make shit, like, we start trading, but in return they obviously, you know, we're not putting our weapons, we're not building nuclear weapons, which was one of the key features, which is like why this kind of guarantor system has really appeared. Was like, look, you know, the nuclear weapons were made and everybody was like, look, you know, we make a non-proliferation treaties, and, you know, we are gonna be like not making nuclear weapons, but in return, you know, like, we're guaranteeing that nobody's gonna invade you. Essentially, the first war with Iraq, the first invasion of Iraq, happened because Iraq has invaded Kuwait, right? You know, it happened because Saddam Hussein just invaded the neighboring country and just said, okay, now you're mine. And that was that kind of guarantee that kicked in, which said like, look, we're keeping the world safe, but in return you're not, because obviously Kuwait had the money to build to at least buy the nukes, to finance the research, and then have some dirty bombs sitting somewhere willing to go off at any time. You know, it's like, but at this point of time, you know, there was a non-proliferation treaty which was guaranteed by major powers, right? And many people will generally use the example of US getting involved with many countries' politics, like Czechoslovakia, I think, was the war in the Balkans, right? But outside really just one case where they invaded Iraq for the second time, generally all the invasions or all work with the people was done on the back of everybody saying, hey, this guy has lost this country leader has lost his wits. He's completely fucking insane. He's doing shit which should not be done. But what was also happening was that in these like 20 odd years after the war in Balkans, what also happened was that the Russia was going around swinging swinging their weapons, like invading countries, behaving like a lunatic, and nobody was doing anything, right? Because we're talking the first invasion of Ukraine, and I listened to the people talking about politics and saying, "Wow, the Russians rolled over Ukraine in 2014." Well, the Russians did not roll over Ukraine. Ukraine was essentially told to stand down. Like, Ukrainians were told, like, "Hey guys, do not fight them, do not provoke them. We're gonna be on your side." And then the whole position of the Europe and the West was like, "You know what? Just take it as it goes. Like, just take it up your ass, okay, guys? We know we guaranteed your security, so we're gonna like sweep it under the rug and kick it into a long grass, and then just kind of continue as we were." Right, they're slowly kind of ramping up some pressure on Russia, but it was like slow, and it did lead to the fact that the Russian president started feeling threatened from inside his country, because the Russian economy was failing faster than he expected. But then he just started the war with Georgia, or no, he started with war in Georgia before the war in Ukraine, but no, he started the war in Syria, right, bombing the living shit out of Syrian cities. Again, nobody does anything, right? It's like, Georgia was 2008, 2014, and then I'm getting confused, sorry. Right, but the West now starts to say, okay, we're going to supply tanks, and the tanks will take a couple of months, because they obviously have to get them out of storage, they have to kind of fix them up a bit, they have to supply the ammunitions for those, because this is the problem as well Ukraine had. Ukraine was supplied with the artillery units, but not enough ammunitions, and the artillery units were not really made to fight in a proper artillery battles, because obviously most of the Western tactics, Western strategy relies on using airstrikes, and West is still being slow, despite obviously the Russians putting quite a bit of money into the pockets of private individuals to try and swindle the opinions of people to actually not fight Russia and suck Russian dick. Okay, they do. Right, I named some of the channels that I came across which do that regularly. Just say, look, let's just suck some Russian dick. But it's ramping up, so the support is ramping up. The West finally kind of going like, yeah, we're gonna send you the armor carriers, and there was a funny case where the West has declared that they will send Bradley, I think, Ukraine West supplies, US supplies, oops, well, they're not tanks, but they're fighting vehicles. Essentially, they're troop carriers, and they all have the capability of killing some old tanks. But they're not. The US did not send, obviously, the latest and greatest of the Bradleys, but they did send some. But they have not really been present in the fighting just yet. But then Russians have already declared that they've destroyed dozens of Bradleys. It's like, well, they have not even reached Ukraine yet, but the Russians are already kind of saying like, yeah, we can't fight in Ukraine. We're destroying those Bradleys. We destroyed those tanks. They're not a problem. The problem is that the tanks and Bradleys have not yet even reached Ukraine. Right? The Russian government, obviously, I'm probably jumping, but Russian government obviously brings in a lot of people, and essentially they're doing this to kill them off. This is why I was saying this, that there's going to be lots of Russians who are going to die who don't have to die, but the Russian government brings them in. There's a video, I have to look it up, but it was shown on Twitter by someone with a translation which shows that they were saying, look, how they were saying to the people in prison, if you have killed someone, if you had been if you have some obviously the reason why you've been put in jail is because you killed someone, you have an armed robbery or something like this, aggressive behavior, something, you beat somebody up very badly, stuff like this. Essentially they're removing the young and more aggressive crowd, and they're sending them to war, essentially to die, right? Because they're trying to hold on to their power, and this is the kind of young people who have something to fight for. They're losing their jobs. This is what you get. This is how you get a revolutionary situation where the people on the bottom essentially cannot live the way they lived before for whichever reason, and the people on the top cannot change to live within the new ways, and quite often they don't want to change, they want the things the way they were. And the Russians essentially trying to kill off their own people, but they also want to punish Ukraine for leading the way and in the changes. Essentially there were lots of positive changes happening in Ukraine before the Russian invasion. There's still some changes going on, not as fast as people would like to as well, but they are happening. And if that was not, the invasion was not the case, I think in the last year we would see some very interesting things coming out of Ukraine, but we shall see how it turns out to be after the war. Obviously makes some things a bit harder to do. But as we're talking about the obviously supplying Western weapons to Ukraine, we cannot speak about something which is kind of the next point of importance, and Ukrainians really go people were talking we really need F-16s, right? So essentially the jet fighters, and the question generally is, does Ukraine actually need F-16s, right? And obviously people who want to suck Putin's dick, they say, look, we shouldn't supply F-16s to Ukraine. People who say look, Ukrainians are already kicking Russian ass, it's we want to show the world that, yeah, we will support you in case you're something I've said before, we will support you in case of invasion by other powers. They say, let's give them the weapons. I mean, especially if the Ukrainian army does the fighting themselves, right? So there's this conversation. It's going to be going on for another few months, I think, maybe 2 or 3 months. At least that's what I hear from people. They say, look, it took them 2-3 months to give Ukraine the tanks, and even if there are people who are willing to supply the planes, obviously it still takes up with a lot of decisions that need to be taken, and a lot of inside talks of who does what and other things. And the question is, obviously, that is quite often posted, is does Ukraine need F-16s? And I'm going to say something. Which most of the people in Ukraine will probably hate me for saying, but as part of this point of making this video was actually talking about the subject, and technically and Ukraine does not need F-16s, right? And I'm gonna cover this subject in a bit more detail, but But why am I saying that technically Ukraine does not need F-16s? Well, the reason for this is that when people talk about F-16s, they say, hey, this is a multi-purpose jet which can shoot most of the NATO missiles and bombs, like especially smart bombs and stuff like this. Right, and if Ukraine gets F-16s, they can obviously use in fighting and in using like air to air support missions. And yes, that is true, but essentially what Ukraine needs is not specifically F-16s. What Ukraine needs is the means of delivering air weaponry, because of the way West fights is because they strongly rely on air superiority. They do have a lot of air weapons, the smarter missiles, the smart bombs, like some other missiles and bombs, which they do have a lot of. They can supply them, and they've been storing them up for ages, and they can be used. And essentially what Ukraine needs is a platform or a number of platforms which can be used to deliver those weapons. So when people say, oh, we have to have F-16s, I find that conversation, to be honest, a bit obnoxious, because it removes the focus from the actual need, which is an ability to use the NATO air weaponry. Why am I saying that? Like, let's not talk just about F-16s. Well, the modern air fights are done in beyond visual range. So let's just look it up. Beyond visual range meaning. Right. So beyond visual range missile is an air-to-air missile that is capable of engaging at ranges 20 kilometers or beyond. Essentially, most of the modern planes, they fight at the areas where they don't see each other. Their speed, it plays a little bit of a role in what they're doing, but quite often it's other equipment, like how well you're connected to the radars, like on the ground. Are you fighting underneath the control, like in your own area, so that the enemy aircraft has to come into your place, into your zone of responsibility? And do you have a support of anti-air kind of missiles and systems, or are you having to fly into enemy territory? And a lot of missions that are flown by Ukrainian aviation are not really deep inside enemy territory, and yes, they exist, but quite often those can actually many of those can be taken care about by simply flying up really high in your own territory and letting off a smart bomb which will fly like 50, 60 or 80 kilometers inside the Russian territory and destroy a target. So there is really kind of no need for those big jets. But another problem you see with this conversation, okay, cool. Let's take a look at this. Let's come back to that. So essentially, because you don't need that capability of super speed, or like super sound flight or something like this, you're not really limited. I mean, yes, most of the people see jets as the carriers of those weapons, but in reality you're not really limited to the jets. There's helicopters capable of carrying a lot of ammunition. There's smaller planes. We talked about what was the name of the plane? I talked about this in one of my videos. Let me just get back to that. Yes, Super Tucano, yep, this one. Yeah, A29 Super Tucano, let's look it up. A29 Super Tucano, yes. So there's this plane. It's a small plane, but it can carry a lot of NATO air-to-air missiles and different bombs and stuff. Something like this as well, capable, can be used. What else can be used? I think it was Chinook helicopter. Oh no, it's not this one. What was it? Chopper, I think. Helicopter. No. There's a helicopter which was essentially produced as an American helicopter, which is recently they started producing in Ukraine, which is an American helicopter, and they were building a factory to build those in Ukraine. Let's look at US helicopter in Ukraine. Oh, I don't remember. I need to look at the. Let's look at the images and see if we can find something. Right, not this. It was the helicopter they used in Vietnam War. Hell, I forgot the name of that helicopter. Yes, this one's. Ukraine Business News, yes. So, for example, this was one of the helicopters here. Oh, there's military focus. Yeah. So the Hue helicopter will be assembled in coming months at Ukroboronprom's Bell Textron's Hue helicopters. The U.S. military workforce in the Vietnam War will be assembled in coming months at Ukroboronprom's Odessa Aviation plant, which is something I already made a video about like some time ago, which was Ukrainian military technology overview, and this is something I mentioned, like I made a video about this, that Ukraine has actually kept a lot of its production capabilities from the times of the Soviet Union, especially when it comes to the military. It was slowly surviving, but they were producing things, building things, and they kept it up. Unlike the Russians, who have destroyed a lot of that, right? The Russians did use the tactics of, giving money to some Ukrainian traitors, and something similar, something which happened near Kherson region. In Kherson region, where the traitors essentially helped the Russians to advance, and again. But the Russians have been using some traitors in Ukraine, or some people who were thinking that Russia is still part of Soviet Union, or some retarded stuff like this. But they were given the money to destroy many Ukrainian enterprises. Something I mentioned in that video of mine. But overall, Ukraine had the capabilities of producing, like I say, just making some basic helicopters which with the modern aviation equipment could carry NATO weaponry, which means that a couple of those helicopters could solve quite a few of Ukrainian basic problems in air support and air transferring people through air and things like this. So this article is from 2021. So I hope that helps. So when people talk about, like say, aviation, when they talk about F-16s, I think they're being slightly, it's kind of, it removes, we need to remove the conversation. And even though I understand that this video probably not going to be watched by people, but I'm throwing my thoughts into the ether, and we need to remove the conversation just from F-16 to just aviation, right? The military aviation capable of delivering those weapons. Why do we need to do that as well? We're not talking about, like, obviously we can have a wider choice of aviation. There's more pilots that Ukraine has that can pilot a helicopter. It does not require that much of relearning, restudying of the controls. Most of the helicopters, they're kind of made very generic, so many people who flew one helicopter can really learn the other helicopter reasonably quickly, right? We're talking speed. But there's another thing, which is when we talk about helicopters or the A-25 Tucano. Let's look it up again. That's a 29. Yeah, Super Tucano. Yeah. So if we're talking about helicopters, if we're talking about these guys, right? Let's look them up. Yeah, if we're talking about these planes, there's something they have which is like makes them quite good versus the jet planes, and cost of 1 hour flight on F-16. Yep. So the cost of 1 hour flight on F-16 is $26,927 an hour. Let it sink in. Like $30,000 an hour, because the jets obviously they eat up a lot of petrol, and it's a very expensive petrol. They do require higher maintenance, like constant maintenance. Cost of 1 hour flight on, let's say, Huey helicopter. It costs to run a helicopter per hour, right? Yeah, does it get 1,700? So if you look, at these, like, so the 1 hour flight costs between $1,000 and $2,000, right? Especially it's like 15 times cheaper, and I think A-29. Super Tucano. Let's look at this. Right, the Super Tucano costs around $1,000 for a flying hour. So essentially, it's nearly 30 times less. You know, why is this important? When it also means that it's like if you get supplied the plane, it's not really just the plane. It's the cost of maintenance, it's the cost of flying. So if you, this plane costs, number one, the engines doesn't get run off as much, so they can fly for a longer time. They can stay in the air for a longer time, right? Which means that they can make missions more often. Right, they might not get there as much, but again, according to, and I'm talking about some opinions I've heard from Ukrainian experts, it's like, you know, just simply having something which is flying just off the battle lines and can literally just swoop in and provide support to the troops on the ground within a couple of minutes, rather than 20-30 minutes it would take the jet because the jets cannot just continuously fly around the area. No, just something like this would actually make a difference. Same as helicopters, right? They can literally land anywhere. So you can take a helicopter, you can fly in, you can land like 30-40 kilometers away from the line and in any field, and you can just take off, come in, do the shooting, go back to your base. Which means that the difference is going to be like of the immediate availability of the air support to the troops. Immediate availability, if there is, they say, oh, we have like, there is a missile coming or a drone coming from that direction, right? They can have these dotted around all the area, take off pretty much immediately. One other things of introducing jet fighters or jet planes into obviously Ukraine. Yes, Ukrainian technicians are very skilled, but nevertheless, supporting those jets, it limits, number one, where they can land. They cannot just land on a road in the middle of the field. Like, they do have to have specific conditions met to be able to land somewhere. Yes, Ukraine has a couple of motorways which have been built as secondary landing strips, but I don't know how well they've been supported, maintained over the years, but it still means that these planes are limited in where they can land, so which makes them easier to target. They also require the infrastructure to be supported, so unlike the helicopter, they cannot just land anywhere and then you have a truck drive up there with the parts and you fix it up in the next in the next few hours. No, the jet needs to land somewhere where there is an infrastructure, where there is like proper fuel is stored there, because as far as I remember, they don't run on the normal fuel like helicopters that can run on essentially A95 or something like this, and all those things play into account. So when I'm saying that technically Ukraine does not need F-16s, I'm not saying that Ukraine does not need the planes and the aviation. I'm saying that it really needs the aviation, but the conversation around F-16s makes that this conversation is going to be long, it's going to be extended, it's going to require a lot of investments, a lot of bullshit is going to happen, and this is why I'm saying the West is losing, because they cannot adapt fast. Like, they have this idea like, oh, if we're going to give Ukraine planes, it's going to have to be something super cool. It's like, no, it has to be something that works. I mean, I'm the kind of guy who, I have a couple of videos on my channel, if you look at them, who says, look, you know, here's a few things which are kind of crazy, but if you put them together, they might make a good system. So here's a crazy idea, right? You take an old An-2 airplane, which Ukraine has a few of, right? This bastard can raise thousands of kilograms of whichever weight it carries, right? You attach the more modern aiming equipment with more modern radar equipment. For example, the Super Tucana has that thing over that thing over here. No, this is, I think this is an extra whatever, but they have this kind of piece of equipment which you can essentially attach underneath the plane, and it will act as a, like, it's a more powerful radar equipment which allows it to catch the targets from much further away. So essentially you take that piece of equipment, you take the aiming system, you attach them to A and 2, which is like to the bottom of the plane or whatever, and then you attach a couple of launch thingies, this stuff where you can attach missiles to, and essentially you can rebuild an An-2 airplane into something which can deliver weapons, like, you know, do missile strikes, or I don't know, throw bombs from like 5 kilometers away if you have smart bombs. But you have to have a means of throwing, because they do talk about giving Ukraine those smart bombs, but what's the point of giving those bombs if each bomb has to be manually rebuilt to fit the few Ukrainian jets that Ukraine still has? You know, but you can rebuild An-2, and you can send 20 of those up in the air, and you've got a very good air support system to the troops, where these planes can fly a long time. But what I'm saying is that kind of long talks about what we give and what we don't give, because it also takes the training time, as other things that come into mind. And unlike tanks, actually, and this is something I told in my previous videos, I'm sorry if I'm being boring, okay guys, but it's me talking, giving a piece of mind to the wall. Unlike something I said as well before in my videos, it was like, look, the plane is not like a tank. You know, if the driver screws up in the tank stops. He just presses a button, starts the engine again, and then they fuck off. You know, if the loader messes up in the tank, okay, cool, the loading time takes a bit longer, right? You know, it's like, so things that happen wrong in the tank, most of them, like 99% of them, are not really gonna kill the crew, right? Jet is something really fast, really complex, and if you fuck up in a jet, well, shit goes sideways at jet speeds, okay? So you screw something up, you press the wrong button, the damage you can do is going to be can be like to the even plane, the loss of the plane. Like F-16 cost what? Cost of F-16. Right, about 12 to 35 million. Right, I think for the old ones. I think the later ones were a bit more expensive from what I've heard, but yeah, so about 25 millions. 25 million going really, really fast towards the ground, just because you screwed something up. Right, I say it goes really wrong really fast. If you have the F-16s, because I was watching some videos on YouTube, they were saying that newer F-16s with newer equipment cost even more than that. So I'm not an expert, just looked it up here. So you can have like a $30 million piece of equipment go into the ground just because you pressed the wrong button or something like this. You know, so planes require a lot more training, they require a lot more investment than a tank. So, and concentrating the conversation just around like one plane, and I understand why people might want to do this, is because if they supply one plane, you know, then that's it, you know, they don't have to worry about like supplying much of munitions. But most of the NATO planes will have an interoperable equipment. So if you can shoot this missile from this plane, you can most of the time shoot the same missile but from a different plane. but how hard it is to become an F-16 pilot, okay? On average, each year only 3 candidates become fighter pilots out of over 1,000 applicants. After obtaining a bachelor's degree, it only takes 2 years to become a fighter pilot. But these 2 years are grueling with intense training and tests. Remember, look at this, like getting something like this, it's time in preparation of the pilots. And remember, each hour the pilot spends flying that plane, just to learn to fly it, cost, what was it, $30,000 plus for every hour of flight, versus this plane, which is $1,000, or this helicopter, which is again about $1,000, which is like engine, petrol, equipment, like, you know, the repair works, everything. That's the difference. And Ukraine right now is on a dire need of having the ability to do airstrikes. It doesn't need to be a super ability, it needs to be an ability because of the way that it will having access to those air weaponry which is stockpiled in the West, literally because the West, the whole Western strategy and tactics heavily relies on air support, which is the Soviet strategy was heavily reliant on artillery fire, which is what we've seen from Russians, essentially shooting up tons and tons of ammunitions from their cannons, but not really hitting anything. And now what we're seeing is, well, that they are running out of ammunitions, and part of it was obviously the help from HIMARS systems, which Ukrainians have used instead of trying to fight one particular cannon or one anti-air defense system. They just use them to blow up ammunition storages. They just went, okay, cool, you know, why blow up one cannon with 20 shells if we can blow up 20,000 shells sitting in the depot somewhere 30 kilometers behind enemy lines, right? But I think that's kind of covers it, right? It covers the planes. After the already 1 year of war, we can say that yes, Ukraine is gonna win that war, and yes, we do need Russians to get out of Ukraine, right? We don't need to start, how would they say, oh, we have to start talking to Russia and then give them what they want. No, we don't need to start talking to Russia until they get out of Ukraine, right? The decision, from what I hear, which is supported by over 90% of Ukrainians, that's a very good support. And we need to talk about what the Ukrainians support, because at the moment we only hear the Russian story about how everybody's, like, at least what we see, like how everybody should really let Russia have its way, and then the Western newspapers, they talk about what West does, but they don't talk about what is actually happening in Ukraine. And there's another thing, which is why West is losing, is they don't have the journalists that really understand it, right? They have the journalists which quite often cover the situation in Ukraine by not even being able to speak Russian or Ukrainian properly, like, you know, they don't have like really good local connections, the understanding of local culture, the understanding of local feelings. What we see is that they do, like, there's volunteers who do better coverage of the war crimes by Russia in Ukraine than by many newspapers. So essentially what you see is the volunteer materials. And as well, this is what we're saying again, that the West is still losing this war, and the consequences of this, as I see it, might be also the fact that we might see more countries like Taiwan, for example, really looking around for that nuke that nobody knows about. because we see that the bully, the crazy guy is not getting put down. We see that the West is scratching their back holes and just like sitting there and spending months and months and months talking about stuff. But that is considering that the guarantors of Ukrainian independence are US, Britain, France signed up for that, and Russia. Like, that was for Budapest Memorandum. And essentially now what we will see is I think many countries are now thinking like, hey, these guys have signed the treaty with those. They got Ukraine to get rid of its nuclear weapons. And now they can't even decide whether they want to give planes to the country so that it can defend itself. Nobody's talking about Western troops going in Ukraine. I think Ukrainians are very much capable of doing the defense themselves. If there is a call for people to go and fight in Ukraine, I personally spoke to people and said, do I need to come? And they said, look, at the moment they only take on people who served in the army, which I never did. But overall, if there is a call that, yeah, everybody goes, I think there's quite a few Ukrainians who have never served in the army but are happy to kind of come and help out, will go. And this is something the West still does not understand. Right? You know, they grew up in the time where, well, you know, you just don't give a shit. And that's where the West is losing, and it will continue losing until they start moving fast, until they stop kind of saying like, we're only going to concentrate on this, we're only going to concentrate on that. If Ukraine wins without even like, with this kind of level of support at the moment, Ukraine will win, but like I say, it will take longer. And the longer it takes, the more civilians die, to be honest. Even I could not imagine how atrocious Russian troops are. Like, I knew they're like in bad shape. I knew they're like, you know, the people who are there, they're like, you know, they're not really the best of the human beings. But the crimes in Bucha, the crimes in Kherson, the shooting, there's a couple of other places near Kharkiv, shooting up, just recently the shooting up of the, essentially, there's a shooting up in Kherson where about a dozen people died, where they shot up essentially a hospital and a bus stop. There's no military there, but that is the level of Russian troops. If you people, like I say, want to give into that, the next thing we'll see is that more and more countries are going to be looking into really picking which safety measures do they want to have. Yes, there is an international conversation about this, but the international conversation, it's kind of being pushed as well forward by Ukraine, saying, hey, what is the next step? But it's also the fact that the West cannot really deal with one crisis, you know, that is gonna really question the way things are at the moment. So I'm gonna finish at this one, otherwise I'm gonna just trail. I think I've said most of the things I wanted to say. If I didn't say them now, then I'll probably say them later in some other video. I really hope the West starts moving. Yes, I mean, Ukraine will win this war. That's not a matter of question. But I just hope that we can, as humanity, decide that, look, you know, stuff like this is not really something we want, and we want this bully out. Like, that's not a bully, that's just a crazy motherfucker in charge. And that Ukraine is gonna get the help it needs to free its territory, so that there's less Russian crimes and there's less civilians that die. And to be honest, that the Russian soldiers remain in Russia and don't die in this needless war that was started by a lunatic to simply stay in power. So, I'm finished now. I wish you all the best of the time of day you have. If you lasted that long, I mean, I would ask you to sign up to my channel, but you probably won't, even if you lasted that long. But I just hope that these ideas are gonna move forward and that things are gonna start changing faster than they have been so far. Thank you very much. Goodbye.